Right now, joining me to go through the papers in more detail, the political commentator Albie Amankona. Albie, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
A dose of humble pie coming from Emmanuel Macron to Keir Starmer. How is he going to take it?
I think it's going to be interesting for the Prime Minister because we all know what Keir Starmer's instincts are. We know that Keir Starmer is a Remainer. He wanted the UK to have another referendum when he was the shadow Brexit secretary back in the Brexit wars when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the opposition. He was calling for another referendum. We know that he wanted us to go back into the European Union, and that is what is in Keir Starmer's heart. But in his head, he knows that the British public voted to leave on the 23rd of June 2016 now, so it's actually almost 10 years ago. And it'll be interesting to see how he manages this. Now, look, I was a Brexiteer. I'm not going to sit here and say Brexit has been a total success. On many metrics, Brexit has failed to bring down immigration. It's failed to bring better economic growth and prosperity. It's failed to bring regulatory reform and divergence from the European Union. I personally think EU membership is not the be-all and end-all when it comes to whether or not the UK is going to do well as an economy. So I think having another argument about Brexit is a little bit of a waste of time. But it'll be interesting to see what Keir Starmer does when actually in his heart he probably agrees with everything that Emmanuel Macron is saying.
What about this tension that drawing closer to the EU might jeopardise that relationship with Donald Trump?
It could jeopardise the relationship with Donald Trump, but it depends how close the UK gets to the EU. And actually, if we listen to what Yvette Cooper was saying on the Sunday morning shows yesterday, Rosie, Yvette Cooper was very clear that the UK wasn't going to be rejoining the customs union, wasn't going to be rejoining the single market, wasn't going to be accepting free movement of people. So it's difficult to see, actually, what new agreement could be done between the EU and the UK, which would actually upset Donald Trump enough for it to jeopardise the UK's relationship with the US.
But then what do we need out of this UK-EU reset?
I think there are a number of different things that we could get from the UK-EU reset. I think things were quite acrimonious during the last round of negotiations, things like mutual recognition of qualifications. I personally wouldn't be against something like a youth mobility scheme. I'm personally not against that at all. Something like a proper defence partnership if we are in a world where we are feeling that the US is less committed to NATO than it was in the past. I think there are plenty of things that a level-headed European Union and a level-headed British Prime Minister could negotiate, which would be for the betterment of both the EU 28 or 27, however many countries are in the EU now, and the United Kingdom, that wouldn't jeopardise the relationship with the US. What we've got to remember is that it's in the interests of the US, the UK, and the European Union for there to be good relations across the Atlantic. The question is, can we get them?
Yes, and also who needs reminding maybe of that? We'll get more details from Brussels in about 15 minutes' time. Also, front page of the Times, Keir Starmer's forced to abandon his personal email account, reports the paper, after security services investigated a suspected Russian hack. Albie, what happened?
It's very concerning, this story, that allegedly Russia hacked into Keir Starmer's personal email address because it wasn't really very well security protected, just with a two-factor authentication, which is essentially what the same is for my email account, probably your email account, Rosie. You'd expect the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition at the time to have a more sophisticated way of securing his email address rather than just the two-factor authentication, which is what the general public have. So it's a really concerning story that his account may have been compromised by Kremlin-linked hackers.
Yeah, the paper goes into quite a lot of detail. He had to then change his email address, which had been dangerously obvious, apparently, and that sort of two-factor authentication was just useless. We believe this happened shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine. Is this sort of political naivety, maybe, that they didn't think, we've had problems in the past. I think it was Boris Johnson's mobile phone number was available online for years. But you'd expect someone going into that position would think, I've got to have much stronger, stringent safeguards here in place because this could be really dangerous.
You would expect that. But also, what we've got to remember is when it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to cyber attacks, the number one reason why cyber attacks are able to happen isn't because of anything particularly high tech, it's because of human error. And that is the case whether or not it's you or me, or that is the case whether or not it is the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition. The way that hackers get into places they're not meant to get into is because of human error. It looks like in this case, that's exactly what happened. There was some human error. The sophisticated anti-cyber attack measures that are put in place didn't work properly because of human error. You can have the most sophisticated, high security anti-cyber attack system in the world, but ultimately, if there's going to be a bit of human error thrown into it, hackers are always going to be able to get in.
Yeah, very
difficult. Perhaps this is just something we have to accept. Obviously, it's shocking when we read about it, we hear about it. Leader of the Opposition, Prime Minister, has had his email hacked. These people, these humans, are just as susceptible to human error as everyone else.
Yeah. And well, people were told without explanation to not email Keir Starmer under any circumstances. Clearly they now, if they can remember getting that email, will know why. I want to talk on the front page of the Daily Telegraph here. Angela Rayner's plan to make flexible working the default for all is going to, says the paper, cement Britain's status as the working from home capital of Europe. They've looked at data from LinkedIn, looking at kind of all the jobs that are available, and they found that 40% of all jobs advertised across the UK were hybrid jobs, so you didn't have to come to the office 5 days a week. Is that a problem, Albie?
Personally, no, I don't think it's a problem if it is a truly hybrid role where there's a mix of both home working and going into the office. Normally, these hybrid roles are you're in the office 3 days a week, you're at home 2 days a week, you have to go into the office, interact with people, go into meetings in real life, or IRL, as a lot of people call it nowadays. So personally, I don't see a problem with it whatsoever. In the private sector. Where I do feel there's a little bit more of a problem is in the public sector, where we haven't seen productivity levels return back to pre-pandemic levels. And I think it's quite easy for someone to say, well, what is the thing that has changed since the pandemic? And now it's working from home.
But do you think performance is related to amount of time spent face-to-face in the office?
I think that it could be. I think when we're talking about taxpayers' money, when we're talking about the public sector, and the public sector has not returned to pre-pandemic levels of productivity and efficiency, and you're trying to diagnose what is it that has changed in the last 5 years, one of the major changes is working from home. Now, that won't be the only change, but it's a major change. And when you're talking about taxpayers' money, I think it's important that everything is looked at to get these people who are working in the public sector productive again. In the private sector, if employers don't feel their employees are being productive whilst working from home, they can ask them to come back and work in the office. They will quite often, they might even fire them, hire someone else if they're able to in that situation. In the public sector, there's much less incentive to do that because there's no financial commercial incentive that the company has to make money because it's paid for by taxpayers. So I think there's a different equation when it comes to the public and private sector. But ultimately, I've got nothing against.
Let's say in the public sector, how many days do you think you should be in the office? 3?
I think 3 days a week. And I think there's been some outcry from people working in the public sector that they're being asked to go into the office 3 days a week. I don't understand why that is such a big deal. It's still better if you argue that working from home is better than what it was before the pandemic when people had to go in 5 days a week. So if that is what public sector bosses are saying, this is what we need to do to improve productivity, to save taxpayers money, then so be it.
There's been such a realignment of expectations, hasn't there, from people going to work and what they expect from their employer, sort of rather than the other way around. Let's talk about school, because there's been a new overhaul, really, of how schools are going to be examined. Ofsted have released the details. We're going to hear from the Chief Inspector of Ofsted on Breakfast a little bit later, actually. The Guardian, though, the front page says the Ofsted plan for reform, the head teachers say, is worse than the old system. Worse how?
So they're saying this new way of grading schools is worse than the old system. And essentially, this old system that was in place, some people argue, contributed to the suicide of, I believe, a head teacher or a school leader. And so this opened up a whole new argument of whether or not these one-word judgments, outstanding, excellent,
and the stress and pressure they put on head teachers
and the stress and pressure they put on head teachers and teachers, whether or not that needs to be changed. So there are changes that Bridget Phillipson is proposing, where they're going to swap single headline grades for the rich, granular insights of school report cards. They want to raise the bar on what we expect from schools, shining a light on all areas that matter. This is what Bridget Phillipson will say in a speech, I believe, later on today. It's not necessarily convince school heads. They're saying, some of them are saying that it's going to lose some of the simplicity of the old system. Laura Trott, the Shadow Education Secretary, says the previous system of one-word judgments from Ofsted provide clarity for parents, and the new system is complicated and will please nobody, and actually will lead to a weaker response to failing schools. This is what the Shadow Education Secretary says. Ultimately, I probably fall down more on the line of Laura Trott on this. I think if students are given grades like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and not really any other further explanation than that, I don't see why it's such an injustice for schools to be given a similar grading system, albeit with words as opposed to numbers.
I think I agree with you. Sir Martin Oliver, the Chief Inspector of Ofsted, is going to be on Times Radio just before 9 o'clock. So don't miss that if you're interested to find out exactly the justification behind the changes. Now, final thing, Albie, this is extraordinary. Inside the Telegraph, SNP ministers are to consider banning pet cats in an attempt to protect birds and other wildlife. This report suggests setting up containment zones where residents could be forced to keep their pets indoors. This is not parody.
It's a pretty unbelievable story, and I say this to you as a cat owner. She's not with me right now. She's probably asleep somewhere else in the house. But I couldn't imagine having to live in an area where I was forced to keep my lovely cat Bluebell in the house 24 hours a day. But this is exactly what SNP ministers are proposing.
They're considering this report.
Considering this report of compulsory containment for cats in vulnerable areas, which means they wouldn't be allowed outside. And this is mostly for environmental reasons. You know, of course, cats go outside. What do they do when they go outside? They're not just playing with each other. They are out there hunting, being cats. Quite often, my cat, when she was younger, would bring back mice into the house and they'd be injured and they'd run around, and it was a huge pain. But that's just what cats do. But in some of these areas, there are wild cat populations. There are populations of endangered birds and other animals. So it's understandable why perhaps some of these proposals are thought of sometimes. But I think the practicality of them would be quite difficult. I suppose the question is, how on earth would this be policed?
Yes. And poor Bluebell, how on earth would you keep her inside? That would be so miserable.
Exactly. Well, luckily I don't live in Scotland, so it's all right.
Thank you so much. Albie Amankona, the political commentator, going through the papers with